It is a fascinating paradox, isn't it? We're living longer and healthier, wealthier lives than any generation before us. But there's still this anxiety, this feeling that we're on the edge of collapse.
Oh, tell me about it. It feels like my social media feeds are just an endless scroll of doom. But these lectures, they offered a totally different perspective. For those of us who haven't geeked out on hours of lectures, what exactly is superabundance?
Simply put, it's about how affordable things have become over time, like how long we have to work to afford something. Think about it. Back in the 1800s, how many hours of work do you think it took the average person to buy a loaf of bread?
Okay, I'm imagining a full day of backbreaking labor in the fields. A lot.
You're not far off. Putting food on the table used to take hours and hours of hard work. But these days, someone working a minimum wage job, they could afford a loaf of bread in less than an hour.
All right.
And it's not just bread. This applies to almost everything. Food, energy, transportation. These basic things are way more affordable now than they were a century ago, even with a much larger population.
That's wild. It's funny how fast we adapt to progress, though. I remember when just having a cell phone was a big deal, let alone one that could access the entire internet.
It really shows the power of human ingenuity, right? More people mean more brains working on problems, leading to more innovation and advancements that ultimately benefit everyone. It's a chain reaction. An idea turns into an invention, leads to better production, lowers costs, improves living standards, this incredible upward spiral.
Despite all this progress, we tend to fixate on the negative.
The lectures explored how our brains, after evolving for millennia in environments of scarcity and danger, they struggle to process this whole abundance thing, even when it's right in front of us.
It's like our brains are still stuck in survival mode, constantly scanning for danger.
And they use this really striking example, terrorism. Since 9/11, Islamic terrorists have killed an average of 7 people per year in the U.S. Now, any loss of life is tragic, but statistically speaking,
You're more likely to win the lottery than be killed by a terrorist.
you're more likely to die from a bathtub drowning, a deer-related car accident, even just a simple slip and fall. But those everyday dangers, even though they're statistically more common, they don't capture our attention like terrorism does.
Terrifying when you put it like that. Because it's true. We latch on to those vivid, scary stories, even if they're statistically unlikely.
The lectures called this the availability heuristic. Basically, our brains judge how likely something is to happen based on how easily we can remember examples of it. Even if bathtub drownings are more common, a terrorist attack is a lot easier for us to imagine.
Because we've seen it, even if it's just on the news. No one's tuning in for a headline that says,
But this constant stream of negativity, it really can warp our perspective. And what's even more interesting is that even when we do improve a situation, our brains have this way of moving the goalposts. It's called prevalence-induced concept change. As a problem becomes less common, we tend to broaden our definition of what that problem actually is. It's like we need something to worry about constantly.
so instead of celebrating the win, we're like, okay, what's the new thing to freak out about?
Pretty much. And this makes it hard to appreciate how far we've come. Think about it. Back in the day, slavery meant actually owning another person. Now, some people say we have wage slavery because we need to work to make a living. The definition shifted as the original problem became less common.
Our brains stuck on the negative even as things get better, and then when things do improve, we just find new things to stress about. So if we're wired for negativity, how do we break free? These lectures mention population growth, right? That's a prime example of the struggle.
Yeah, it's a really interesting case. You've got this very real concern about the environmental impact of a growing population. In fact, the lectures mention this anecdote about a 27-year-old woman who feels like she can't bring a child into the world in good conscience because of climate change. And that's a sentiment a lot of people are wrestling with these days, especially younger generations.
I get it, for sure. You turn on the news and it's all one heat wave away from total environmental collapse. It's easy to feel hopeless.
Those fears, while understandable, they don't always reflect the full picture. Alongside those concerns about too many people, there's also a ton of data showing that we're actually getting better at handling the challenges of a bigger population. The lectures pointed out that Morgan Stanley, the investment firm, they're even factoring this decline in births into their economic forecasts. They're calling it the Great Birth Decline. And they believe it's happening much faster than any decline in fertility rates before.
Wow. So it's not just some fringe theory then. Big players are paying attention. Speaking of individual freedom, though, the lectures also spend a lot of time on free speech, especially how it relates to innovation.
Absolutely. The lectures argued that free speech and open markets, they go hand in hand. They're both key ingredients for progress. When people are free to speak their minds, challenge the way things are, even be a little rebellious in their thinking, that's when innovation really takes off.
The reasonable man adapts to the world. The unreasonable one tries to make the world adapt to him. So all progress depends on the unreasonable man. And honestly, a lot of the most innovative people throughout history, they weren't exactly known for being easy to deal with, right?
That's a great point.
Which kind of makes me think sometimes the qualities that make someone a pain are also the qualities that let them break new ground.
Exactly. It's about embracing that friction, that willingness to be different. And the lectures, they argued that a free market where ideas can be tested, success is rewarded, and yeah, even failure is embraced, that's the best system we found for that kind of environment.
So innovation needs space to breathe, to experiment, even to totally flop sometimes.
Exactly. They said, in a system where losses are shared but profits are limited, that feedback loop gets messed up. No real risk of failure, no real reward for success. It stifles things. A lecture's actually tied this aversion to capitalism back to, you guessed it, our evolution. Our brains, wired for tribalism, for everyone being equal, they still struggle with this idea of huge wealth gaps. Our sense of fairness, it can clash with how a global economy works.
How do we balance wanting fairness and equality, but also understanding that progress might need some risk, some competition, maybe even some inequality?
The lectures offered an interesting take on that very dilemma. And it depends on understanding the difference between two worlds that we live in, really. Think about it. There's the world of our personal lives, our families, friends, communities. That's where empathy matters, cooperation, that sense of fairness.
Yeah, that warm, fuzzy feeling of being surrounded by your people.
But then there's this other world, this bigger, more impersonal world, global economics, international relations, tech innovation. The lectures called it the macrocosm. And the rules of this world, they're not always so warm and fuzzy.
More like cold, hard cash, cutthroat competition.
You got it. And the lectures, they talked about this economist, F.A. Hayek, who said a lot of our frustration, our anxiety, it comes from trying to force the rules of our personal lives onto this larger system.
Like trying to run a giant company like a family dinner, not going to work.
Exactly. Hayek argued, we got to recognize that these two worlds, they just work by different rules, and that's okay. In fact, it's vital for progress, trying to impose personal relationships, emotions onto something like the global market. That's a recipe for disaster.
But then the challenge becomes, how do you operate in both those worlds without losing yourself?
The lectures, I think they gave a big clue when they talked about knowledge. The more we understand how these systems actually work, the better we can navigate them. Question those narratives, especially the ones that make you afraid. Look for evidence, data, a balanced perspective.
You don't have to accept everything you're told. Look for yourself. Learn. Make up your own mind.
Humans, we're incredible at solving problems, at innovation. But that spark, it starts with being curious, being willing to look beyond the headlines and engage with the world in a way that's thoughtful.
I love that. A call to action for all the curious minds out there. Go learn, question everything, and maybe, just maybe, dare to be a little optimistic. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious.